I want to share with you an ugly but honest thought. Have you ever gone on YouTube and the first thing to catch your eye is a video titled, "How Insert Video Game Changed My Life"? Maybe it's a game you've played and that's what captures your attention. You click, and after a few minutes, you realize it's an inherently personal and tender topic that has just as much to do with the creator's life experience as it does the game's contents itself. You finish the video. You scroll down to a sea of comments praising the creator and connecting with their experience, and you think to yourself, this is ridiculously pretentious. Why is this guy talking more about himself in a video that is supposed to be about Clint Stevens? Did he really just spend several minutes whining about his MapleStory girlfriend, who was probably a middle-aged guy in real life? Why is he so dramatic about Donkey Kong Country? You don't miss the old Nintendo. You miss being happy. Don't worry. The reason I feel comfortable bringing this up is because these are all sentiments I've received. The very concept of examining one's uniquely personal connection to a video game is pretty much the backbone of my entire channel, and with that sometimes comes adverse reactions. I'm not mad at the people who have said these things to me. Well, I definitely was for a fleeting moment, but for a much longer one, they made me think twice about what I was sharing and how I was doing it. Should I have kept these thoughts in my head? What if, perhaps less intensely, you watched a video titled "How Outer Wilds Shook Me to My Core," and by the end you didn't even outright disagree with it. You similarly felt Outer Wilds was a well-designed game about mystery and discovery, but didn't feel the presence of any deeper, life-altering themes. Does that invalidate your experience? I don't have to imagine that feeling because I've experienced it. Not only as I was in the midst of playing the very game in question, but certainly with others I've never felt the same spark with. It can feel kind of weird and off-putting, right? There's a disconnect. On October 21st, 2021, the developer of indie darling Stardew Valley, Barone AKA ConcernedApe, went live on his YouTube channel to showcase a trailer for his first new project since his debut commercial release. And let's just say, as a bit of a hardcore fan of Stardew Valley, I was kind of awestruck and obsessed with it. But even regardless of any specific information revealed about Haunted Chocolatier, there was one inconspicuous detail I haven't been able to get out of my head for what has now been several years. In Eric's blog post announcing the game, he stated,
"Don't think for a moment that, because this game features ghosts in a haunted castle, it is an evil or negative game. On the contrary, I intend for this game to be positive, uplifting, and life-affirming."
Life-affirming video game. In other words, a game suggesting that life has value. It's not exactly widespread terminology, and it's definitely not a genre, but I think the concept is absolutely infectious. And after previously drawing a connection between Stardew Valley and its life-affirming themes for myself, I desperately wanted to define this idea further and share my findings. I gathered recommendations from friends and made a list of games I've already played with what I believed were life-affirming qualities, beginning to play and replay to broaden my understanding. But almost immediately, something didn't feel right. I began with Night in the Woods, a game all about returning from college to a home that doesn't quite feel like the home it once did. But maybe because I never left home to go away to school, I just wasn't feeling it. I started replaying Celeste because its themes depicting anxiety, depression, and queerness are well documented and have connected deeply with many of its players. But when I first played Celeste, sure, I could feel the presence of some of those elements, but they didn't really speak directly to me. And I couldn't shake this idea of it being reductive or even kind of fake to approach discussing them through the lens of someone else's bond with the game. It wasn't my connection to discuss. Everyone told me to play Before Your Eyes because it would make me cry. It's baked into the design itself, and I have yet to play it. I quickly realized I was playing these games for the wrong reason. While I could continue to play and try to analyze their themes from a somewhat more objective point of view in an attempt to present an informative discussion, the entire pursuit just felt wrong to me. And in having to answer for myself why that was the case, I think I realized exactly what I needed to say. I still want to try to define what I believe is a life-affirming game, partly because I've been holding on to this idea for years, but more importantly, because I think there's an even more interesting idea to unpack beneath it regarding how we all perceive video games. And to do that, I need to simply revisit some of the games that have already spoken to me. So let's just start there, with a game I'm certain has not only provided great intangible value to millions of players, but has connected deeply with me on a multitude of levels and kicked off this whole train of thought in the first place. What could be none other than Stardew Valley. I think what makes Stardew Valley the quintessential life-affirming game to point to isn't just because that's how its creator views it, but because both its initial premise as a self-described country life simulator and its refined execution of the concept has proven to be highly attractive to not just a huge market of traditional gamers, but really almost anyone, because it's kind of an idealized view of the human experience. One question often tossed around regarding these sorts of life simulators is, why? When video games are so great at providing escapism into these immersive, fantastical worlds, allowing players to roleplay as someone else, or simply to live out a power fantasy without other responsibilities or consequences, why would someone want to play a contrarily mundane, alternate life simulator? Why would you create a character that looks like you, pursues the same goals as you, and watch them from an omniscient point of view while they live the life you should be out there living for yourself, touching grass and shit? I think these questions, while valid, fail to consider the real benefits of living a virtual life. There are no social norms you feel forced to abide by. You can fast forward through the boring parts. And really, there are much fewer cultural and economic barriers stopping you from experiencing an idealized view of what you may desire for your own life. And that's not to even mention how additionally beneficial this can be for somebody living with a disability or chronic illness who is physically unable to participate in some of the more traditional communal aspects of life. As a child, too, when the days felt so much longer, and you looked around at all the adults doing cool things with their freedom without perceiving how mundane and stressful all those moments in between are. I think this is especially enticing. It's why, when I was a child and discovered games like The Sims and Harvest Moon, I was surprised but almost immediately intoxicated with the premise. It wasn't even so much about living a parallel day-to-day life. It was about rapidly experiencing all the cool aspects of life I was aware of but unable to participate in for myself. I was spamming that Rosebud code like no tomorrow so I could build the bachelor mansion and try to figure out what woohoo meant. What are they doing down there? Are they wrestling? There was something different about Harvest Moon though. There were no money-generating cheat codes to abuse. And rather than fast-forwarding through the workday, it was about slowly, repeatedly engaging with excessively mundane tasks, all in pursuit of larger goals or to simply unwind and relax. There was also a uniquely quaint atmosphere to it, with genuine love and appreciation for a simpler way of living. When I first discovered Harvest Moon, where I lived, I swear, everyone had a garden. I could walk across the street and pick the neighbor's raspberries whenever I wanted. My parents had their own cherry tomato vines. And right next to the swing set I played on every day, our next door neighbor had this huge garden patch taking up half of his backyard that was the spitting image of what can be found in just about every Harvest Moon game. Having a garden was simply a staple of my childhood, and in Harvest Moon, I could have my own. There was something so satisfying about seeing those crops spring up so I could accomplish other goals without having to worry about soil quality, pests, and optimal watering. And it all transpired in a much more reasonable time frame a child could appreciate. That was the beginning of my connection with Harvest Moon, and in that stage of my childhood, that was all I needed from it, even when following series entries introduced new spins on the concept to keep it all interesting. No matter the goal, I was mostly just interested in that farming loop, cultivating crops, caring for livestock, and making small upgrades around the farm. As I grew older though, and my interest naturally began to wane, the tedium and monotony of grinding the same tasks again and again with minuscule fundamental change from game to game began to feel more like a barrier than something I could endlessly engage with. That is, until the release of Stardew Valley. Suddenly and surprisingly, after the genre lay almost completely dormant for several years, that farming gameplay loop not only returned, it was also pretty much perfected. While Stardew Valley wonderfully preserved the essence of Harvest Moon with a similar approach to core activities such as foraging, mining, fishing, and of course farming, what was most impressive was the greater harmony between all these activities and how much additional depth there was to uncover. By pairing these skills with an RPG leveling system and unlockable crafting recipes, the game gently nudged players in the way of engaging with all of its professions in order to secure all the greatest upgrades, machines, and of course, new farm buildings. Unlike any of the Harvest Moon games from my childhood, the farm was fully customizable, allowing new buildings to be freely arranged with any assortment of crop patches, equipment, pathways, and decorations to beautifully tie them all together. It even allowed players to easily rearrange their buildings at any time, lending to some utterly gorgeous farm layouts. With the game's first major end goal being restoring Pelican Town's community center by donating specific items in exchange for incremental rewards, the push to encourage players to engage with all of the game's core mechanics was fully realized, and it was addictive. It was so addictive, in fact, that after playing for upwards of 30 hours in its launch week, I actually disconnected. I didn't even complete the community center. It's difficult to recall exactly why I bounced off it so hard, but I think it was because I felt as though I was living more of my life in the game than anywhere else, when I was already being pulled in several different directions, and that distressed me. In any case, looking back, I realize I'd approached this game the exact same way I did Harvest Moon, extracting a great deal of value from its raw, mechanical appeal before rapidly burning out and moving on. And for several years, that was my relationship with Stardew Valley, a game I'd easily rank as one of my favorite releases of 2016, but one I'd also barely scratched the surface of. As if I knew there was so much more greatness in store for me, I just didn't feel ready to dive back in. And, well, we all know what happened in 2020. The truth is, when I first played Stardew Valley, I was rapidly approaching a downward spiral in my personal life, one that necessitated a fundamental change. I had to move forward and leave behind the things I thought I wanted to pursue a new job and bring a sense of routine back to my life. And while the transition was certainly rough, it was through that process that I discovered so much about the real me. My impact was more visible, recognized, and offered me the space to grow. I connected with my peers, and when I rolled up to work and saw the look of relief when they realized I would be overseeing them for the evening, in spite of the job's natural downsides and hardships, I just felt happy. It was honestly the first time since my childhood that I felt a real, strong sense of belonging outside of an online space. With the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, due to no choice of my own, that was suddenly ripped away from me. It kind of broke my brain for a bit, coming to terms with the fact the career path I had chosen abruptly became unviable. And much like countless others undoubtedly experiencing a similar change, I dove into video games like the coincidentally perfectly timed Animal Crossing New Horizons for a sense of relief. Ironically, those mundane, often social, life simulator games reflecting a parallel view of many people's day-to-day became a vehicle of escape from the new wave of uncertainty and dread accompanying the pandemic. But while Animal Crossing was enough to stem the bleeding, so to speak, I found myself drawn back to Stardew Valley for a real sense of healing, and it had everything to do with its more direct message. I'd argue there are several layers of life-affirming appeal to Stardew Valley, the first of which just happened to be the only one I was mature enough to identify during my first bender with it. As a casual speedrunner and enthusiast of single-player games featuring a time management aspect, like Pikmin and Majora's Mask, the possibilities for optimization within Stardew scratched that specific corner of my brain. But maybe because the routines I was following were truly ordinary, and most importantly, replicable, it kind of reinforced to me how crucial it is to follow a consistent routine in my own life. In the chaos of rotating between opening and closing shifts while failing to give myself the proper rest to put my best foot forward, something that should have been so obvious was often taken for granted. After establishing that routine in-game with its own optimizations, I then began to explore what I describe as its second layer, one I largely neglected in all my prior Harvest Moon playthroughs. In Stardew Valley, it's easy enough to ignore socializing altogether in favor of focusing purely on individual advancement, especially as there's really nothing requiring players to consistently interact with the surrounding townsfolk that typically first come off reserved, indifferent, or even antagonistic to your presence. But after taking the time to get to know them, not after a single conversation, but after several in-game seasons or even years of nurturing the relationship, do they begin to reveal their true personalities and vulnerabilities that have a lot in common with what I believe countless players of Stardew Valley face on a daily basis. It's critical this aspect is never forced on the player, because the slowly prodding, organic nature of the discovery results in a much deeper bond with its characters that each reflect touching, human struggles and triumphs with their own strange nuggets of wisdom. It's also because that's how real people are. In real life, embracing solitude and isolation is easy and frictionless, but combating loneliness takes real work. Instead of waiting around for someone to find you, what you receive from a relationship is often the result of what you put in. The final layer is less obviously visible in the game itself, but is nevertheless there. After graduating from college with a computer science degree in 2011, Eric Barone struggled through awkward interviews for entry-level jobs before being struck with an idea. As a resume builder and programming exercise, he decided he would take a break from job hunting to create his own video game. And as a multi-talented creative, he felt strongly compelled to do it all by himself. We've all seen the end product, acclaim, and romanticization of the purely solo, independent game development journey as a result of Stardew Valley becoming one of the greatest selling indie games of all time with over 30 million units sold to date. But what is often glossed over are the struggles and intense pressure that preceded it, presumably out of an obsessed and perfectionist mindset. The scope and estimated development time ballooned from an initial 6 months to just short of 5 years. During that time, Eric relied on his family and girlfriend as the sole breadwinner, constantly having to reassure them that its release was just a few more months away. All while darker thoughts regarding the game's quality creeped into his mind as he destroyed and rebuilt core features, code, and art again and again to better reflect the continuous improvement of his skills. Was he wasting his time? When money grew tighter and he took up a part-time job working evenings as a movie theater usher while coding and designing during the day, he associated the development of his passion project with embarrassment. Oh, this guy's a loser. While some days were spent diligently working on Stardew Valley for upwards of 15 hours, others were marred with extreme unproductivity and guilt spent browsing Reddit and binging other games, likely in response to the natural burnout stemming from tying so much of himself and his values into such a personal project. How could he not be obsessed? All of these aspects coalesce into an experience that to me is all about taking back control of your life. While my favorite Harvest Moon game, Friends of Mineral Town, begins with a series of flashbacks of the player as a young child falling in love with all the ideal qualities of farm and small town life, just as I was around that age, Stardew Valley begins with a choice made out of desperation, just as the player's character begins to feel crushed by the burden of modern life. They decide to abandon their mind-numbing city lifestyle to create something new in Stardew Valley. By giving up their hopeless corporate job where their impact often feels invisible, every action they take results in more tangible growth. By embracing a small, tight-knit community where it's impossible to feel lost and alone in a sea of people constantly coming and going, Stardew Valley demonstrates how nurturing small social circles, as well as sheer day-to-day proximity, can spark the beginning of a lifelong relationship. When I was feeling truly isolated and lost with all the time in the world and none of the direction in 2020, I leaned heavily upon this game, playing for hundreds of hours, sharing it with my loved ones, and learning as much as I could about what it took to create it. And throughout that process, Stardew Valley showed me what I really wanted: to take back control. I was tired of giving so much of myself to line the pockets of a faceless hierarchy of shareholders and C-suite executives. I was tired of failing to take care of myself, and I was tired of meandering through unending cycles of inconsistency. I wanted to create something, and like Eric, take ownership of every part of the process, good and bad, prosperity and hardship. While the meteoric success of Stardew Valley is truly an anomaly, the scale of which could be owed to correct timing and luck, if you want to call it that, I would be lying if I said the story, particularly with respect to the struggles Eric faced, didn't instill a bit of hope in me. And even if you don't particularly connect with that element the same way I did, the result of that struggle, perseverance, and passion is still a game with several layers of nearly universal, life-affirming appeal that millions of people have connected with on a variety of levels. And that, to me, makes for an undeniably life-affirming video game. But what about a game that, instead of providing several different layers to peel back over hundreds of hours of playtime, offers an exceptionally concise experience, leaving just about everything on the table before slamming the door in the player's face, cultivating a response of unquestionable division? It's of course possible you've never played Firewatch, but I'd wager you've at least heard of it or have even watched somebody else play it. And among the obvious reasons as to why that is, there is one critical design choice that has cemented its legacy for years to come. Firewatch has a bit of a reputation.
That was disappointing.
Following the completion of Telltale Games' The Walking Dead and before being gobbled up by Valve to work on Half-Life Alyx, directors Sean Vanaman and Jake Rodkin departed from Telltale to form Campo Santo, where they and a team of just 10 others would create Firewatch. As a bit of an evolution of the types of adventure games the two were making at Telltale, Firewatch was supposed to be a first-person, highly immersive, branching narrative adventure set in a beautifully stylized version of the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. While the game world itself is relatively small and contained by open-world standards, through its winding design, memorable landmarks, and navigational tools, it provides enough freedom and sense of discovery to uniquely immerse players in a gripping, interactive narrative that almost feels like an intersection between film and video game storytelling, full of jaw-dropping moments, time skips, mystery, and most importantly, raw humanity. It tells the story of Henry, a regular guy from Boulder, Colorado, who, over the course of a single summer, goes on an intense journey of self-rediscovery after taking what is typically an exceptionally boring and lonely job as a fire lookout, spent scanning the horizon for fires and not much else. But what makes this journey unique is the reason Henry is here. Henry's hike into the Shoshone is juxtaposed with a text-based prologue depicting his relationship with his wife Julia through a series of snapshots that are meant to convey one of the game's most vital themes: player agency. Through these snapshots, you make a series of simple choices influencing the relationship: your drunken opener, what kind of dog to get, how you feel about kids, and how you respond to conflict. But in what feels like very little time, things begin to take a turn. As the accompanying piano and guitar begin to crash into one another, the choices steadily become more and more difficult to the point of gut-wrenching discomfort, especially after many doctors suggest that Julia may be suffering from early onset dementia at the age of 41. As her condition worsens, instead of trying to decide what to name your dog, you're having to decide whether or not to put your wife in a full-time care facility, or if you're going to block the bedroom door with a chair to sneak out for a late-night drink as Julia sleeps and Henry slowly drifts from the relationship. And with Julia either finding herself in a memory care facility, failing to recognize her husband more and more with the passage of time, or taken back home to her family in Australia as a result of Henry's struggle to deal with the situation on his own. That's when the in-game narrative begins. No matter what choices you make, the end result is the same. Henry finds an ad in the paper for the summer lookout job. Even when there isn't a choice to be made, the necessary action to take is underscored with your input, in a way emphasizing that lack of choice. Henry takes the job. The following 3 to 5 hours of gameplay takes place over the summer of 1989. Henry reaches his lookout and over the radio meets Delilah, his sassy new supervisor, who, according to another key character, is a record you don't gotta flip. And this is when the allure of Firewatch really begins to sink in.
No! Oh. Hey,
What the hell's wrong with you?
my rope snapped coming down the shale slide.
You didn't break anything, did you?
No, I think I'll make it.
Be careful, for Christ's sake.
Aside from the exceptional writing and performance of their dialogue and banter alone, the development of their relationship is the heart of the narrative, as major and minor plot events occur around them, revealing more about the type of person Delilah is, subsequently giving the player the freedom to respond in whichever way best matches their own interpretation of Henry.
I need you to feel safe out here.
Don't worry about it.
Oh, you can protect yourself, huh?
I just don't worry about it.
Perfect. Keep that attitude up and you'll have an excellent summer.
Firewatch actually released just weeks before Stardew Valley over 8 years ago, when I was at the peak of my aforementioned spiral, and the manner in which I played it reflected my life experience at the time. Growing up, I managed to fumble my way into just a few romantic relationships before fumbling them altogether in tremendous fashion. My first girlfriend went to a different school, and after falling for each other fast and hard, yet purely over text messages, meeting up for the first time was painfully awkward and doomed to fail shortly after. My next relationship began after falling for the girl who was supposed to be coaching me through my pursuit of another. If you've played Firewatch, maybe you can see where this is going. It was all an absolute mess, overwhelmingly due to my choices and naivety. But I think a lot of it happened because often behind those text messages, this extra barrier giving me more time to think while obscuring the real effect of my actions, I felt way more comfortable expressing myself in an honest and particularly raw way. Whether that was in a caring manner or another that could best be interpreted as overly emotional, slightly problematic, and wildly immature. And because I was the one consistently getting dumped, perhaps they felt the same. I believe now that in most cases, I was more infatuated with the idea of a relationship, digging deep and moving fast before I had really gotten to know them. And that led to some exceedingly poor decisions that, while ultimately teaching me some valuable lessons, cannot be looked back on without some embarrassment and regret. For a while, they caused me to retreat deeply inward. And I think that's why I took to Delilah so quickly. Over the course of the first act, as Henry is tasked with investigating potential fire hazards and tense situations around the surrounding forest, Delilah slowly pries away at his past. Her personality really is the perfect foil to Henry's. Where he is apprehensive, straightforward, and guarded, she is pushy, confident, and often deeply unserious.
There's some guy out here giving me the creeps.
The creeps? Wait, he's looking at you? Is he doing anything else?
I don't think so.
Henry, there's something someone should have told you about this area.
What is it?
It's outside.
Come on.
She projects this quick-witted, amusing charisma, especially in response to Henry's developing paranoia that cuts straight through the tension. And after enough prodding and time to ease into the relationship, my Henry loosened up, beginning to reveal the truth of what brought him to the forest. There is a particularly hard-hitting moment in which Henry supposedly wakes up in the middle of the night to a call from Delilah, and picks up the radio only to hear Julia on the other end, followed by a brief but warm conversation. as if to suggest that these two women are beginning to blend together in Henry's mind.
Okay, Jules.
Delilah seems nice.
Sure.
2 weeks later, Delilah reveals that on that very night, she received a call from Henry mumbling in his sleep on the other end, repeating the name Jules over and over. And from that point on, an undeniable connection is sparked. After Henry asserts he shouldn't be here and that he's simply running away from his problems, Delilah reassures him that his desire to escape is valid by revealing her own problems that brought her here. Through nothing more than the sounds of their voices, they connect deeply over their shared fuck-ups. And having repeatedly followed the same cycle in my past adolescent relationships, leaving me feeling deeply insecure and despondent, this rattled me. In a way that can only be explained as a pure projection of myself onto Henry. Just as he let Delilah in, I allowed my wary, broken self to be pried open. Embarrassing maybe, but in the moment, it was both freeing and intoxicating. And 2 weeks later, on day 76 of the summer of 1989, Henry awoke without his wedding ring. In the following 4 days, the forbidden romance is put on hold as the narrative takes a shocking swing into an absolute whirlwind of uncertainty and conspiracy. Henry is knocked out cold after discovering a misplaced document recounting his and Delilah's conversations. And from this point onward, I began to hobble my way around the Shoshone trying to uncover the mystery while constantly looking over Henry's shoulder as they both begin to mentally unwind.
No.
We are screwed.
No!
Dee, just don't freak out, okay? Don't freak out.
Oh my god, what the fuck is happening, Henry?
But after days of frantically scouring the forest for answers, uncovering a research site with serious monitoring equipment and reports profiling both Henry and Delilah in great detail, and the start of an accidental fire that begins to engulf the entire forest, Henry ventures into the cave just down the hill from his lookout and discovers something neither conspiratorial nor enlightening, but unbelievably tragic. The body of a dead boy, Brian Goodwin, thought to have gone home after unceremoniously abandoning the same lookout his father was stationed in 3 summers ago. There never was a conspiracy. Ned Goodwin, the same shadowy figure Henry bumps into in the canyon at the beginning of the summer, who is behind much of the disarray fueling his paranoia, falsified these reports after slipping up, hoping to turn him and Delilah against each other to direct Henry away from the forest. The unstable acts of a PTSD-riddled and disgraced father trying to cover his tracks after being unable to face the consequences of losing his son in a tragic climbing accident. In the midst of my playthrough, I found myself so tense, so wrapped up in the possibilities of this conspiracy that I didn't even consider how the narrative could possibly continue without it. And so even as an intense wave of guilt washed over Delilah, feeling responsible for Brian's death, for failing to alert the Forest Service that a child was snuck into the park against the rules. Even in the shadow of a dead boy, the young, romantically fractured me clung to all that was seemingly left. I wanted to see Delilah. I begged her to wait while the forest burned around us with a rescue helicopter waiting to evacuate her to safety. And I was devastated after reaching Thoroughfare Lookout empty without a trace. It was no longer about Henry seeking temporary refuge from his world collapsing under the weight of terminal illness. In my haste, I didn't even remember to take his wedding ring home. Even to the bitter end, I still asked Delilah to come back to Boulder with me, the response to which was, of course, no. It was over, and I was crushed. There was no other emotion that could better encapsulate this moment than disappointment. It wasn't until taking the time to allow the experience to settle did it sink in that the crushing wave of disappointment was the point of it all. Even though the game is all about providing choices and dialogue, the consequences of which could often lead to great change in the narrative of other story-focused games released at the time, in Firewatch, there could only ever be one outcome. The story ends exactly where it began, with Henry having to once again face his grim reality, from a new perspective this time. Because Firewatch isn't just a commentary on escapism. It's a rude awakening about having to confront that desire to run away, to put off, to forget, and move forward while facing life's hardships head on. And for me, that was about realizing that if I continued to meander through life in a jaded, broken state, I was only ever going to be met with more hopelessness, more shaky relationships built on such a feeble foundation, they would inevitably crumble under the weight of my own instability. If I didn't change, I was dooming myself to a Henry-themed loop in which I would always be waiting to be saved by another Delilah. But what if that wasn't your experience at all? What if, instead of looking back on your experience through the lens of your emotional baggage, instead of connecting with these incredibly flawed characters and suspending your disbelief of the absurdity of the situation, you just picked up Firewatch hoping for a believable, tight, and engaging story to follow? What if you saw an entirely different Delilah than I did? After all, as early as day 2, Henry overhears a conversation between her and another lookout in which she can clearly be heard saying,
No, I don't think he has any idea.
and after being called out for it, responds defensively, insisting that it's none of Henry's business.
Henry, that call was work. I was just talking to... Actually, it's not really your business. Why are you freaking out?
This happens the morning after Henry's lookout is broken into on the second night of his brand new, isolating job. His paranoia is arguably justified, and as his boss, Delilah's inability to handle the conversation with patience when her subordinate already feels unsafe is kind of a failing on her part, and is just one indicator of how unprofessional and shit she is at her job. She begins to pry at Henry in a drunken state on his first night. She's the one that suggests not talking to police after some teens Henry has an altercation with are reported missing. And even if he urges her to tell the truth, she still files a report that neither of them ever spoke to or saw them. She's the one that insists on flirting with a married man in a manner that is frankly really pushy and uncomfortable should the player choose to reject her advances. And this all happens before shit really hits the fan. Who's to say there isn't more to her that is yet to be explained? Who's to say she isn't lying about more things, like her involvement with Ned Goodwin? Why, in one evening, after it has become clear they're both being watched, she supposedly hiked all the way from her lookout to Cottonwood Creek in the middle of the night to stash a new radio for Henry, passing right by his own lookout on the way. How is it possible that after several summers on the job as the supervisor of this whole operation, she knows nothing about the Wapiti research site that is clearly visible from her lookout? She's not just awful at her job, she's a terrible person. There's enough to believe she's lying about everything, just like she lies to Henry, to the police, and to the Forest Service about an unreported child living in Ned's lookout. She is responsible for Brian's death. How is it possible that after a father and son have gone missing for 3 years, Delilah, the last known correspondent with Ned Goodwin, has not been questioned? Or is she lying about that too? From this perspective, what is the message here? That indulging in escapism is inherently problematic, and that kicking the can down the road will only ever lead to more anguish and heartbreak? After all, while Ned and Delilah seem able to walk away from their awful decisions, poor Henry is dragged into their situation and is left to pick up the pieces after having to return home to his own highly dysfunctional life. How could this reframing of the narrative not recontextualize that disappointing resolution as anything but ill thought out? There's no justice, no explanation, no payoff, leaving only a longing sense of what could have been, justifiably cultivating a harsh disconnect between a more skeptical, morally responsible player and the intended message of the narrative. How does that make for a life-affirming video game? That's not quite how I feel. But the fact that this is a perfectly reasonable interpretation of the narrative is why I, and evidently so many others, seem to keep coming back to Firewatch. There's a special feature in which 86 audio logs of developer commentary are interspersed throughout a replay of the game, discussing anything from its game logic and visual design, to the impact of certain story beats, or how Campo Santo's entire creative process was so messy and baffling at times that the reasons for certain decisions dictating other decisions could commonly go completely forgotten, perhaps explaining why the story wasn't as airtight for its harshest skeptics. There's even a few logs expressing a mixed desire to go back and retool certain sequences for the betterment of the entire story, like that early confrontation with Delilah, or the research site break-in, the latter of which was so tight that it may have led a few too many players away from its intended emotional through line. But what I found so fascinating about it all is really the absence of any direct effort to confront players with a clear message about escapism. Instead, primarily focusing on cultivating a natural push and pull between the player and the themes of the narrative. It's even possible to completely miss a critical conversation with Delilah. According to Sean Vanaman, should the player choose to tell her everything about Julia or nothing at all, Delilah will share her experience with her ex-boyfriend, Javier, an exchange that was vital in cementing my attachment to her. Should the player follow the middle of the road of this sequence, it can be entirely skipped over. And what this means is that Firewatch's narrative tries its best to adapt to whomever is playing it. It presents players with a series of choices that are sometimes frivolous, other times agonizing, or oftentimes no choice at all to be realistic. In real life, sometimes we have the power to change our situation, and other times we don't. But being able to adapt to the world and relationships around us is often the only way to survive and move forward, especially in the face of hardship and loss. I was lost when I first played Firewatch 8 years ago, grasping for this fictional relationship because I had yet to understand that no matter how hard I thought or loved, I could not make someone else love me. 8 years later, however, with a stronger sense of self and having since faced my own losses, I feel a greater sense of responsibility while actually understanding Henry's behavior. The desperation and hopelessness that follows this reality as a desire for a complete, utter escape begins to boil over. How many players saw the writing on the wall and put Henry's ring back on? How many, when given the choice to ask Delilah to stay or go along ahead without him, effectively reframing the entire ending, chose to accept the conclusion on those terms before the credits even rolled? Because that's what Firewatch allows you to do. Sean purposefully wrote this scene not to patronize the player, but to simply convey a harsh emotion and reality, while allowing them to interpret and adapt to it. They understood not every player will connect and that some will reject, and they were comfortable with that.
I wanted that feeling to go into the player, that level of disappointment, and then for some players to think, man, but how disappointed would I really be if I was him? And obviously we can't make you think that stuff, but if we do, then I feel like the story has been successful in communicating the emotional payload that it set out to provide.
My life experience is entangled with my interpretation of this game, and so is yours, whether you connect with it or not. And that to me is the basis of what makes Firewatch a life-affirming video game. There is value in recognizing when you have lost control to be able to move forward. In a video game with something bold to say about life, tactfully choosing when to embrace agency and when to abandon it is of vital importance because it is an inescapable factor of life.
Bad things happen, okay? And you have to find a way to contain the damage, a good way.
It's crazy what a video game can attempt to say about life, isn't it? Because life is obviously such an active experience. To me, having the ability to choose, to react, to participate, is what makes these messages feel like life lessons. The friction is essential. And then there's Outer Wilds. When I first completed Outer Wilds, more so than Stardew Valley or even Firewatch, I felt as though it was a more transformative experience than any other video game I've encountered in my lifetime. I believed it reawakened a sense of curiosity and hope in me that was dormant for quite a while. A desire to experience new things, to learn, to reflect, and that compelled me to share my interpretation of its meaning with the hope that it could help someone else, the nature of which was built upon a connection over shared grief. As such, I became increasingly protective of my experience, one based upon blind recommendation, the type that requires you to be both deeply curious and trusting of the person encouraging you to play it. Outer Wilds, a nearly flawless masterpiece. Outer Wilds critique, the most important game in years, examining an existential experience. This game gave me an existential crisis. How the best video game DLC changed me forever. How Outer Wilds changed my life. How Outer Wilds shook me to my core. Including my own, these works almost always begin the same way, with a warning. Outer Wilds is an experience unlike any other that is best enjoyed completely blind to any details beyond the fact that you play as an adventurous new recruit of the spacefaring Outer Wilds ventures. A group of explorers venturing forth into the farthest reaches of their local solar system, hoping for nothing else but to expand their understanding of the universe. You fly a spacecraft greatly tuned to simulate real-world physics. You explore different planets, each with their own highly entertaining quirks, often resembling celestial bodies in our own solar system. And through its environmental storytelling, you discover the remnants of a past civilization that has long since disappeared prior to your arrival. This is what largely makes up the moment-to-moment experience of Outer Wilds. But if you're not already a part of the established in-group of players who have completed it, perhaps the Outer Wilds Club? I cannot speak to you about Outer Wilds. Do not proceed until you have purchased and completed potentially the greatest video game ever made. One that, for all intents and purposes, can be uniquely challenging and frustrating for players who may not be as prepared to absorb its notably loose narrative structure or progression loop that frequently involves a breakthrough discovery, followed by smashing into a brick wall again and again until the rules of this universe begin to click. For a game like this to so often be described as life-changing, what is the greater effect of this lens on an unsuspecting but curious first-time player? Because I can tell you that, while playing it, the first real emotion I felt just beneath my initial curiosity could best be described as bitterness, a bitterness eventually swelling to the point of outright resentment. Outer Wilds first appeared to me at a time in which I was not ready to wrestle with it, and at first, I dismissed it. In the midst of COVID isolation, instead of seeking out new experiences and challenges, I sought comfort, leaning not only upon Stardew Valley, but just a handful of other known quantities that honestly defined a lot of my personality at the time, ones with a clear structure laid out before me. But Outer Wilds kept popping up, first by close friends, and then by what felt like the internet as a whole, all speaking around me about the sleeper hit they could not get out of their head. A nearly flawless masterpiece. The most important game in years. From the outside, I looked upon these perspectives with skepticism. Not because I didn't trust those around me, but because I was worried that if I didn't feel a strong, natural inclination to dive into it for myself, it wouldn't have the same effect on me. Sure enough, however, this feeling of existing outside the in-group drew me into its grasp as I decided to at least try to understand how this game became such a formative experience for so many people. I remember my very first play session, in which I ended up in a dark, abandoned mining site, startling myself after stepping into a bizarre, visionary pool before being interrupted by a phone call. And as I continued to try to play and talk concurrently, rereading the same disconnected, out of context string of dialogue over and over again, before suddenly being engulfed in a strange burst of light and seeing my memories played back to me frame by frame, I realized, okay, this is not something I can sit back and just passively absorb. The world of Outer Wilds quickly demonstrates how indifferent it is to your presence. After presenting players with nothing more than a few strange curiosities during its introduction, before asking them what they would like to accomplish, rather than suggesting what they should do on their first expedition into space, the entire solar system is laid out before them, complete with an entropic ocean planet whose towering cyclones hurtle its scarce floating landmasses into space, one whose brittle crust, pelted by constant eruptions from its volcanic moon, steadily crumbles into the black hole at its core, and where your spaceship's autopilot does not account for the gravitational pull of the titanic sphere of inconceivably hot plasma at its center, dragging you into certain doom. Even if you manage to survive 22 minutes in this alarmingly hostile corner of the galaxy, that strange burst of light you may not have even initially understood is eventually revealed to be the center of your world collapsing in on itself, quickly engulfing you and everything around it in overwhelming obliteration. The initial appeal is certainly to simply explore, familiarize, and envelop yourself in these amazing natural phenomena, all while small narrative breadcrumbs merely hinting of the existence of some greater force begin to present themselves. I found great joy in simply giving myself up to this world in pursuit of following my natural curiosity, allowing the beginning of a new loop to act as a sort of checkpoint, marking my departure to a new area, especially after some more particularly frightening encounters. But that began to change after I was faced with the reality of having to dig deeper rather than continue to explore outward. First, I accidentally stumbled upon a series of monumental discoveries without the proper narrative context to understand how important each revelation was. Then, as my comprehension was properly tested for the first time, I failed repeatedly, to the point of outright embarrassment. And even when I scarcely managed to overcome my inability to pause and think critically in order to solve whatever specific problem lay before me, I was consistently met with more roadblocks and no lead to continue following. Suddenly, my initial worries were realized. Instead of merely continuing to exist in this incredible new world, as my goals shifted, I found myself trying to fight against it. The absolute freedom that once brought me joy and comfort suddenly made deciding where to go next paralyzing, as I panicked over how much time I was wasting. I struggled to understand what the point of it all was, as each major discovery led me straight into another brick wall, the frequency of which frustrated and fatigued me. And even when I knew exactly where I needed to go, my fear froze me in my tracks. I desperately wanted to see what others saw in Outer Wilds, but under the weight of my own expectations, my curiosity began to rot away, revealing a bitterness towards the game and even those I trusted. I was beginning to feel as if they led me astray. It was easier to be resentful than accept that my mindset was the problem. And so after starting and stopping again and again over the course of several weeks, absorbing setback after setback, I abandoned Outer Wilds indefinitely and quietly became its #1 hater. For the average player, Outer Wilds can be completed in roughly 20 hours. With enough determination and a steady flow of progression, this can be accomplished in about a week or even less. Needless to say, I did not see the credits in just 1 week. From start to finish, I managed to finally complete Outer Wilds over the course of an entire year, one that happened to mark the beginning of one of the most tumultuous periods of my life. After over 365 days of COVID isolation, I finally went back to work, only to realize just how much I had changed before deciding to carve out a new, terrifying path for myself after weeks of agonizing over such a shift. And after working tirelessly to adjust, what soon followed was the delivery of the single most devastating news of my life. The center of my world, whom I sought desperately for continued guidance, comfort, and hope throughout all of my greatest struggles, was collapsing under the weight of terminal illness after more than a decade of fighting. The latter half of my life was spent running away from the present with the hope of a better future, stressing greatly over the loss of precious time, often down to the minute, out of fear of time running out. which factored greatly in my decision to reject and try to move past Outer Wilds. But now, when I look towards my future, instead of seeing a light forward, there was nothing but darkness. It was up to me to find my own way to cope with that reality to survive. Not unlike Henry, what I wanted, what I desperately needed, was a means to stay anchored in the present and momentarily drift as I began to long for my own escape. And that's what brought me back to Outer Wilds. I remember just after Christmas that year, the last Christmas I would share with my mom. I locked myself in my room for a week after learning there was even a sliver of a chance of exposing her to COVID and accelerating our family's destruction. So I booted up Outer Wilds and drifted. Some loops I spent thinking about the Nomai, poring over all my information in search of a new lead forward. And many times I was unsuccessful, but other times I just allowed myself to drift and observe, once again finding comfort in the stability of the loop and giving myself space to breathe a little. Instead of continuing to associate all my past discoveries with disappointment, I put them all into context, each a lesson in not only demonstrating the rules and patterns that were key to unlocking the secrets of the universe, but lessons in how to ultimately stay present, shed my shame, let go of my frustration, and stand up to my fear. By the end, I wasn't even thinking about my great expectations anymore. I simply decided to meet the game on its terms, and that's when it welcomed me in with open arms. What is certain is that Outer Wilds prompts reflection. On a more granular level, it challenges your perception of what video games can offer, from their overall structure to their means of storytelling and payoff. But similarly to Firewatch, by refusing to hold my hand and bend to my will, it was unafraid of rejecting me until I was ready to welcome it, when I ultimately needed it. And I don't even know if, by its completion, what it showed me was some unique, inconceivable revelation that transformed my perspective. It merely reflected my experience with it back at me, one whose intensity was uniquely amplified by the concurrent circumstances of my life. I overcame my resentment, my stubbornness, and my fear associated with this game over the course of one of the most mentally taxing years of my life, as it simultaneously spoke directly to a deeply personal struggle in between the beats of the narrative. Unlike other games that washed over me in a matter of days, I remember exactly where and who I was when I began, when the sun exploded for the first time, when my heart sank with disappointment, when I felt like giving up, when I had nowhere else to go but drift through space, when it finally clicked, when all the pieces of the narrative fell into place, when I confronted my fear, when I learned it was okay to accept what was coming. It was impossible to look back on my experience without viewing it through the lens of my impending loss. And now that my loss is behind me, when I remember her, I can remember the joy and hope I found in continuing to seek challenge, follow my curiosity, and learn. When I roast a marshmallow or look into space or envelop myself in the tear-jerking compositional brilliance of two banjos plucking 7 years apart, I can remember her. There is value in lost love, as long as we carry on and let it guide us. The future depends on the past, even if we don't get to see it. Years ago, when I first began to try to define the life-affirming game, I immediately began to stumble over this desire to find a compelling common thread between any game that could be vaguely linked to this idea. It's no wonder why I struggled. The life-affirming game isn't as concrete as a defined genre, commonly used mechanic, or storytelling trope, but it is a connection and shared meaning we often bring to life by creating or examining a piece of art from our own perspective. What these games say about each other is what they say about me. My longing for a sense of control that can feel invisible in my life has frequently led to feelings of extreme loneliness and distance, even when I know I'm surrounded by people that love me and words of encouragement. But there is something different and beautiful about seeing your thoughts echoed without having to put them into words. And with respect to video games, this is deeply ingrained in the fact that through my input, my ability to overcome friction am I able to establish an authentic connection with a creative work. But by that same virtue, it is entirely possible to play any of these games or any others commonly associated with this idea and to not feel the same energy, or learn something new about yourself. And with a little more reflection and distance between myself and these raw experiences, what I've learned is that is no less valid than the formative experience. As diverse people, where we derive value is diverse. It is valid to reject Henry and Delilah's dysfunctional relationship, or see Stardew Valley less as a relaxing, inspiring routine simulation and more as an overwhelming exercise in time management. It is valid to bounce off Outer Wilds, just as it is to complete and appreciate it for what it is without seeking some deeper meaning within it. And that is precisely what I think makes these games amazing. They know what they are. They are unafraid of not appealing to the widest audience possible. And in doing so, they seek to speak to emotions and issues that may be uncomfortable or may even ring hollow to some, but are invaluable to others. Weirdly, I think now that I've realized this, I can finally divorce myself from these unreasonable expectations and go back to discovering these works the way I was always supposed to, following my curiosity instead of seeking examples to fit a definition. Chasing the life-affirming game is a losing battle because, more often than not, the life-affirming game finds a way to find you, especially when you need it the most. There is a risk in creating this way, a great risk, just as there is a risk in inflating the impact of these experiences to others. Because realistically, the average person will not be able to connect with your personal experience or interpretation of a creative work to the same degree you do. The average and the personal are at odds with each other, and because of that, it can often feel easier or more comfortable to simply fit in, be predictable, and seek validation from the widest group possible, especially in a culture where one's value is so often dictated by the sum of this metric. And yet, we still crave this connection because the value of one vulnerable, authentic bond so often outshines that of the superficial many. I won't pretend these video games transformed me from something I was into something I'm not. I still struggle in my fight to regain control. I still dance a fine line between letting my passion guide me and allowing my emotions to steer me off course. And I still worry about the future all the damn time. But when I think about the person I want to be, I can envision the lessons they shared with me. When I look back on my own work, in spite of what the world most often deems successful, what I am most proud of and what really drives me to continue pushing forward is the understanding that my words helped or inspired the one. And so I have to ask myself again, should I have kept these thoughts in my head? No. It was worth the risk.